Okay, in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to formulate your research questions and how to complete this particular chapter of your project. What's important to bear in mind is that all of your work should be typed in the Google Classroom assignment set up specifically for the research questions, and that it should be submitted by the deadline date that you have been given. Now, in all likelihood, you will have discussed at quite a lot of depth with your teacher what your 3 research questions are going to be. And before I go into how to complete this particular part of the project, let's just consider for a second what a research question actually is. So in the previous tutorial, I was introducing you on how to write an introduction to an investigation, and I went through a model investigation, which was focused on an imaginary project being completed on a river and how rainfall influences that river, and specifically how it influences the behavior of the river in urban environments. So if we hypothetically carry that through as if that was the project you were doing, this example applies to that. Now, if that is your aim, how does the river change when it rains, and does it change more in urban areas? We would want to then have 3 particular angles which we wanted to look at. Now, you can actually investigate a whole massive range of different factors to do with how rivers change when it rains. We're specifically looking at the urban angle. And we have this idea, or we would have, if we were doing this project, have this idea that urban environments change the behavior of the river because they change the surrounding landscape, which influences the flows of water off the surface and how quickly water gets to the river when it rains. So a research question is a particular area that you're going to look at in regards to your aim. It helps you achieve your aim or part of your aim. So the aim is normally framed and worded quite broadly, as we did in the previous tutorial. Whereas a research question has to be very focused. It has to narrow down exactly what you're going to do, because at the end of the project, when you arrive at the conclusion, it is the thing that you are going to seek to answer. It is a question at the end of the day. It's a research question, so you're going to look to have answered it. And you don't want to answer anything other than what that question is. You want to stick very tightly to the question. So let me show you how to go about doing this. The first thing is to break up your aim into 3 areas, and those 3 areas should be, to some extent, interlinked in some way or other. And I'll show you how these 3 research questions are all interwoven into each other, and how later on, if you were to do a project like this, how they would then later on develop into a full project where everything is connected. Some students treat these as almost 3 mini investigations, so each question is very disconnected from the other one, and that's the wrong approach to take. All of these should be linked to your aim. How does the river change? Why is the river changing? And it should all have something to do with the role of the urban environment. And you should never stray away when you're framing a research question from what you're actually aiming to achieve. So in this first research question, first of all, before I actually say anything more, you'll notice I've got a nice big clear heading, research questions. And I've gone for a larger font then, done it in bold. I've also I've typed it's research question 1, research question 2. So I'm using subheadings here. And that's just providing structure and research question 3 to my project. Now, what I've now got here is the actual research question. Now, I've put it into italics in order to make it stand out. You can maybe change the font if you want. These are really important, these research questions. Your whole project is going to be centered around each one of them, gathering data to help you answer the question, presenting data that helps you answer the question, analyzing the question. So getting the question right is actually incredibly important, and that's why you've got to spend a bit of time on this particular part of your investigation. So what is the extent of change downstream in different river characteristics? And are these changes more pronounced in areas where there is significant urban development around the river? Now, you could leave it just at that, and some students do just leave it at that. However, some students then like to go a little bit further, where they have a little bit of description that just fleshes out the research question, which is what I've done here. So this focus will investigate the changes in 3 key river characteristics. So what I'd be saying is I'm going to look at 3 things into the river, which later on we would maybe find out would be the discharge, the bed load, size, and the efficiency of the channel. So we could be looking at 3 different things. We're going to investigate change the 3 river characteristics as identified by the Bradshaw model. So we're using the Bradshaw model to determine what those river characteristics are going to be. And we're going to look at what extent they change. So how much are they changing by a lot from one location to another, or by very little? It will aim to establish whether changes in these characteristics are more pronounced when the river passes through an urbanized area. So we think about the question says, how does a river change, and is it more significant in urban development? So what we're saying here, or we're telling the reader that we're going to look to see whether in essence, we're going to see whether there's more of a change as the river's passes through a town, or is the amount of change just the same as it is at any other location. Now, because this is going to be a particular research question which will have data, raw data, numbers, we're going to be able to quantify those changes. We're going to be able to turn them into percentages, for example. And because we are dealing with numbers and we're going to have a very clear-cut answer to this question, it is possible to formulate a hypothesis. Okay, so there is a hypothesis that's going to go along research question 1. And that is the percentage change in each characteristics will be higher when the river passes through an urban area. So based on our prior reading and in the introduction, we would have trailed that idea that we're expecting rivers to change more dramatically in urban areas because of the impact that urban areas have on rivers. That we're actually going to be bold enough to say what we expect to find. Now, we don't need to find that they're higher. We do not need to prove it's higher. We might actually end up proving it's no different, or that it's actually lower. But at the moment, based on the evidence we have on the background research we've done, we are expecting it to be higher. Okay, and if you are going to come up with a hypothesis, the burden is upon you by the time you get to your conclusion at the very end of your project to have answered that hypothesis. Was it higher? We haven't said that we think it's going to be a lot. We've kept it quite broad. We're just expecting it to be higher than at other locations. Right. Obviously, because most of your projects, as a matter of fact, all your projects are likely to be broken down into 3 research questions, you're going to want to follow the similar pattern for research question 2. Now, talking about interlinking research questions, the second research question is to do with the rain event. We're now trying to look to see that when it rains, how does a river characteristic, and this time we're just looking at one, we're not going to look at all 3, we're just going to look at discharge. How does the discharge of the river change along the course? And does it change more? And we say that it's in the second sentence when it flows through an urban environment. Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. Now, obviously, that's linked to the previous question, because in the previous question, we will have probably identified whether the river was changing more in the urban area than in other areas. And if we had proven that there was more substantial changes, we might then quite rightly expect when it rains for those changes to be more pronounced in the urban area. So that's what I mean by linking research questions. So by the time we then look at research question 2, this focus will examine the influence that an urban environment is having on the discharge of a river when it rains. So does the fact that when it's in a town cause the river to go up more? Now, as with research question 1, this will involve you gathering data. You'll have some numbers on the discharge all along the river, as well as obviously when it passes through the town. And therefore, you can once again formulate a hypothesis. So hypothesis, the rate of increase in discharge during a rain event will be higher at locations when the river passes through an urban area. So we are once again saying we expect it to be more in urban areas. And by the time we get to the conclusion, we will be aiming to respond to that hypothesis. Okay. Now, the third research question, once again, it's all got to be linked to this idea that rivers change when it rains and they change more in urban areas. But we're taking a slightly different tack here. We're now looking at the fact that if rivers do indeed change more in urban areas, then they're obviously more likely to flood in those areas, and flooding impacts on communities. So this question is, have flood events impacted on communities that live near the river? And have these impacts worsened in recent years? So by doing this piece of research, we're actually changing the direction slightly. We're now looking at a bit of human geography. We're going to probably be doing some surveys to gather some information from local people about flooding, and we're going to do some historical analysis, maybe on the internet, to look at local media to see when there have been floods in the community in question. And therefore, a little bit more fleshing out, this focus will determine whether the river has flooded in the past, and if so, what impact it's had on the local community. It will consider whether the issue of flooding has increased in recent years, potential evidence to support the idea that urban development and or climate change is impacting on this river. And you'll remember, if you can remember from the previous tutorial, that was a key idea in justifying why we want to do this project. We want to see if maybe development or indeed maybe even climate change, we can't prove ultimately whether climate change is, but if we do notice that the town is behaving, the river's flooding more often, especially around the town, then that might suggest it's got something to do with the increasing amount of buildings being put up, or it might even actually suggest that these things are getting worse because of increased rain events. Where at the end of the day, we're not going to actually aim to prove that climate change is happening because of our river flooding more often, but we're just putting that in there to say that that's what we're thinking of doing. Now, you'll notice here we have no hypothesis, and that's really because this research question is unlikely to generate much quantifiable data. That's numbers, for example, from flow meters and all of those kind of pieces of equipment that would be used to gather data for the other two research questions. This is going to be more to do with research on the internet and interviewing people. So most of your findings for this research question are just going to be reporting what people say and any particular evidence you find on the internet to suggest that there is an issue here to do with flooding and to do with building around the river. Now, let's just summarize what are your key objectives. First of all, there isn't a word limit, and you want to keep the word limit as short as you can for your 3 research questions. There is actually no marks explicitly available for this section, but without this section, you cannot do the next chapter, which is your background research, because your background research is actually focused on the 3 research questions. You also cannot do your findings, because your findings are all structured around answering these questions, and you can't come up with conclusions because you don't have any questions to conclude, nor do you have any hypothesis to answer. So you'll understand why it's really important. You want to very clearly indicate each of your 3 research questions using subheadings. You want to reword and make your research question as tight as you can, tweak it. Make sure you have a very clear question that you, in your mind, you know how you're going to go about gathering the data to try to answer that question. And you may choose to have these mini paragraphs which just add a little bit more detail to the research question. They're not essential, but you might think that the reader is not going to understand my research question unless I give them a little bit more development. Remember, at this stage, all we've done is we've introduced what we're studying and in our introduction and why we're studying it. And we've given at the end of that introduction, a very brief paragraph outlining what we're intending to do. So reading these mini paragraphs is the first time the reader is going to start to have a sense about what your project is about to involve. Okay. Right, so that concludes tutorial number 5. Complete this in your Google document set up in the assignment for the research questions and submit it when you are finished.